Welcome back, Swagat, once again to the International Kindness Festival IKF 2021 Day 2. Right now we are in the presence of, and we will be hearing the story of one gentleman whose record is of being the longest held captive of Al-Qaeda. We are talking about a much dreaded militant organization, and Stephen McGown is someone who was in captivity for 6 years. And yet that spirit in him, that human value of kindness is still intact. And how does he actually manage to do this? And to help us decipher and decode is someone who's a defense and strategic affairs studies expert, in fact, Shanthie D'Souza. In this conversation with Stephen, Shanthie, and as in fact Stephen takes us through his life-altering experience and talks about how he used empathy as a survival tool. His story is one of resilience, but also of overcoming adversity amidst harsh weather conditions, a different culture, a different language and religion. So he's going to shed light on the concept of freedom being an attitude and the importance of acceptance and communication. Now it's over to you, Shanthie and Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's definitely been an honor and a privilege to speak at the International Kindness Festival. And in these times, I think this festival finds more resonance and meaning, given the way the world is going on today. And we have heard such fascinating stories of the festival, and we have one more fascinating story which is coming up soon. My job here is basically to introduce the subject very briefly, since I'm a researcher who has worked in conflict theaters in South Asia and Africa and other places. I have edited books and written extensively on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and also on violent extremism. And herein, I think this whole concept is so useful for security-dominated approaches used to counterterrorism, to understand empathy. We all know that counterterrorism is a strategy where force is used to neutralize extremist groups and terrorist groups. But at times, we also find that disproportionate use of force is very counterproductive and leads to a situation where these groups not only get more encouragement and more drivers to recruit people, but also have a larger appeal, and which is not really understood. So when you're looking at empathy as a survival tool, which Stephen will talk about, I'll talk more from a academic and a theoretical perspective, and also based on a practitioner point of view, given the fact that I've worked in Afghanistan for more than a decade now in various capacities. And I've tried to understand the conflict situation there using different prisms. And one of the interesting aspects which I thought this festival really highlights is that empathy is not really being used. When you're looking at violent extremism and ways of countering that, you're always looking at countering something which is existing. And there's very little attention or very little focus given on the prevention aspect of it. And I think herein we need to understand why prevention is more important than just countering violent extremism. And in this whole debate of prevention, where do we stand? So as the festival has rightly pointed out, the 3 layers of my basic remarks, which is to look at a very global phenomena at a global level, where you have groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and then you do have groups like Taliban, which are operating in Afghanistan. And one can go back and forth about questions about how these groups run, what are the factors that have appeal that individuals join this kind of groups. You can go into a debate of whether it's the ideological component or whether it's a social, psychological, or economic component. And there are various factors. So there's not really one causal factor which drives the individual to join these organizations. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to understanding the conflict or ways of addressing the conflict. So when you're looking at the global phenomena, you see this group still having that appeal and young people joining these groups. The second is to understand at a local level, and that's where I think my field experience in this conflict theaters, particularly in South Asia, and my trips to Afghanistan have opened up that idea that, it's just not being a researcher there, As a researcher, you are supposed to be objective. You are supposed to have a very clinical objective of looking at a particular data and writing your reports and your work, which I do. But there's one part of me which is also gets affected by the conflict, and therein you develop that empathy. You develop that understanding and attachment to the people, and that's why, despite being in trouble situation many times and very difficult circumstances, I do feel like going back to Afghanistan because you tend to feel for the Afghans. And this is very different from people who read newspaper reports and have very stereotypical images of Afghans and Afghanistan. So one is the Western media, which puts out these negative stories about Afghanistan, that there are only violence out there, there's only killing out there, and everything is lost in Afghanistan. That's not a fact. Second is you don't understand Afghans. You go through what you have read about Afghans. You don't know Afghans yourself. So you have the stereotypical images of them that they are very prone to switching sides. They are turned to the highest bidder and they don't have any honesty. That's really not true. So herein, I think the local and the empathy part of it is very important to understand the local culture, to work within that ethnographic data, which gives you a different perspective of the conflict vis-a-vis just sitting in maybe AC offices and universities or research institutes and churning out from your secondary data and writing brilliant pieces on a conflict theater. So that is a local aspect for me in terms of understanding empathy. And I have met people and I have been in situations which are close to kidnapping, because Afghanistan is again one such theater where kidnappings have occurred. And Indians working in development projects have been subjected to this kind of situation, which has been very traumatic in their own way. And all of them have their own coping skills and ways of getting out of that situation. But I haven't got there yet, and I don't intend to, so I'll not talk about it much. We'll leave that to Stephen based on his experience. The third is to look at individuals. When you're talking about the self, what are the push and pull factors that drives the individual to join these extremist groups? You can't say for sure it's just the economic factor, because if that's the case, it's not true that all poor people are terrorists. Or it can't be just a socio-psychological phenomena. There's more that has not been really understood and studied. And therein, I think for us, as researchers, as academics, and as practitioners, to understand the part of empathy is very, very critical. Now, when you look at empathy, it's a very critical component of psychology, which has not transgressed, and we don't have an interdisciplinary approach when we're looking at the security-dominated approach of using counterterrorism and other such strategies. So when you look at empathy per se, why is it useful? First, I think it is to understand why are certain individuals drawn to certain organizations. But more than that, when you're talking about the drawing in process or the radicalization process of it, it is also a way of getting them out, which has not got the attention it should be. That is, the first is to disengage them from the process. And secondly, and more importantly, is to reintegrate them into the society. And when you look at the situation in Afghanistan, and I've met quite a few of those who have surrendered and come back in terms of the reintegration program, this aspect of empathy has not been used very well. So people who have surrendered and come back have not been accepted by society, or they have not got those benefits which they had been promised. And that's why they do go back to their organizations or to the insurgency. So one is that aspect. Second is to look at an environment which you create, like in situations like even in terms of when you're looking at India's Northeast theater, the conflicts there, or you're looking at Afghanistan, again, you need an environment of forgiveness, because once an individual who has gone on the path of violence comes back and the society doesn't accept them, then you're creating a problem both for the individual and the society. So that interface, I think, has to be used and seen through an emphatic lens. And also building those exit ramps where individual can come out from these groups and gradually transition itself into normalcy. And this is very important for those approaches which we are talking about when we are looking at conflict resolution or the violent extremism. And lastly, and more importantly, is also about capacity building. Now, if you look at societies in South Asia or the governments in South Asia, the state response has been very force-dominated. What we need to look at is to build that capacity within law enforcement agencies to understand that empathy is also important. You need certain social psychological counseling centers for individuals who are prone to join these groups. Likewise, you need to do more at the community level. And here, when I'm talking about community, we are looking at schools and families as a basic tool of how these individuals get drawn into, and when we have certain kind of counseling or a psychological help which is provided at the right time, so that these individuals do not get into this kind of groups. And if they do, even if they're dabbling with this experience, if they have to come back, I mean, they need that support network. And so, if you look at this entire concept, it's difficult to understand how empathy will help, but it does, because when you're looking at a grassroots level, the whole idea of empathy seems to be missing, that you don't understand the other individual and you're using all the wrong techniques and not getting the right results. So here, I think I'll just stop with my initial remarks and then we'll take the conversation forward. But when you're looking at empathy, I think this is the right step and a timely intervention. And I'm happy to be a part of this conversation. Over to you, Stephen.
Dr. Shanthie, very nice to be speaking with you today. I'd like to just really start by saying that, I myself, I was just a tourist. I'm a normal person. I was a tourist. I have been to varsity. I have studied a few degrees. I was working in banking, in London for a few years. But really, everything I'm going to speak about today, between you and I with our conversation, is really things that I experienced. I've never studied this. I've never done any doctorates or what have you. But I basically was in inverted commas, the school of Al-Qaeda and Islam in the desert. And prior to me being kidnapped, I always had an interest in Islam, to try and understand Islam, but I never really got into it. So everything I'm going to bring to this conversation today is really what I learned, what I saw, what I learned from Al-Qaeda. It doesn't put me on either side of the fence. I am very neutral. I'm right down the middle. I am just talking to you really about what I experienced. And during my time in the desert, I was held for 5 years, 8 months, literally to the day. I was kidnapped on the 25th of November and I was released on the 25th of July. So it was literally 5 years, 8 months to the day. And it was an incredibly long experience, to say the least. And, when I was kidnapped, Al-Qaeda in North Africa or Al-Qaeda in Mali were still in their infant stage. They were doing a few attacks here and there, jumping the border from Mali into Algeria, going across into Mauritania. But they were literally a few 4x4s, and they would drive in somewhere, let off a few bombs, shoot a few guys, and flee back to Mali. But during my time in the desert, there were many seasons, and I don't mean summers and winters, although there were many summers and winters. There were many seasons within Al-Qaeda. I saw young boys, guys I saw an 8-year-old. He was the youngest Al-Qaeda member that, when I was there, grow for 5 years, 8 months, and he ended up what 14 or 15 years old. I saw young men grow beards from not having any facial hair to growing beards. People who were shorter than me growing taller than me. So I was saturated within the Al-Qaeda environment, and I had no conversation with the outside world. I had no idea what had happened to the credit crunch. I had no idea. I had very little idea about the attacks going on in Europe, in Berlin and in Paris and in the US, in London. So I really was absolutely immersed in Al-Qaeda. No conversation with my family for 5 years, 8 months. So everything that I learned there was really straight from Al-Qaeda's mouth. And I watched Al-Qaeda. I obviously arrived in the desert being a non-believer, being a kuffar within Al-Qaeda's eyes. I was a Christian. And, I had never studied this. I had a number of learned survival techniques. Everything there was basically learning day by day, trying to make sense of a situation. I had a British passport. I had dual nationality from living in the UK for 7 years. So now I was South African for 36 years, and I was now South African British for 3 months when I was kidnapped. And this was pretty irrelevant for Al-Qaeda because the fact that I had a British passport really put me right at the top of their food chain. I would be the first out of all of us prisoners. I would have been the first to being killed. And our prisoner dynamics was not great. We were 3 different nationalities. There was a Swedish individual kidnapped, myself, and a Dutch individual kidnapped, and we didn't get along between the 3 of us. And it really was about trying to live, I suppose. Prior to this, I was in London during the London bombings when King's Cross Station was blown up, and I saw on the internet about a British man getting beheaded, Edwin Dyer, and I was aware of all of this, and it became very aware to me that since my neck was the first to be slit, I really things had to change. I could not continue to being that piece of rubbish. I mean, within Al-Qaeda, I was told that being British, having a British nationality, I was the most hated. But also, not being a believer, not being an Islamic believer, I was the lowest form of life. As per the Quran, is the way they interpret it. At least goats and sheep, you can slaughter them and you can eat them. I was purely good to be slaughtered or to get money. And I would be held until the war ran its course, or until the negotiation worked out and I was finally released. But certainly, I was terrified. I mean, what do I say? I was absolutely terrified. I was so out of my depth. I was thrown into a new country, a new environment, a different language, right down to different clothing, different foods, no shelters. I was so out of my depth. And the way Al-Qaeda used to look at me in the beginning, they would look right through me. They would look right through me like I didn't exist. The head of Al-Qaeda, his name was Yahya. He was the head of Al-Qaeda Mali. He wouldn't actually even speak to me. He would have a junior sitting next to him, and he would ask the junior to ask me something, but yet I was sitting 2 meters from this man. He treated me like I didn't exist, like I may as well have been a table or a chair or something with no substance. And it took me a couple of months to try and figure out exactly how this whole thing was going to survive. We were 3 different prisoners there, we were 3 different prisoners in the desert, 3 different strategies, 3 different lives, and me being the most hated, it was an indefinite prison sentence. I had no idea if it would be 1 year or 5 years or 100 years. I had absolutely no idea. And there was a turning point, and the turning point happened relatively soon, maybe 6 or 8 months into my time in the desert, and it was the need to survive. And I suppose, when you have a gun against you and you actually can count down the seconds and you say, well, now I've got 5 seconds left, 4 seconds left, I've got 3 seconds until I'm dead, you really start to try and figure out what's important in life. And it was here that I realized that one of the most important things for me there in the desert was to be liked. I truly believe people are less likely to kill you if they like you. And I mean, since the topic here is about empathy and, trying to survive difficult situations and kindness, I realized that I needed to be liked. But I also realized that, X period of years, because it was X period of years, was an indefinite period of time. And if you are if you are in a certain environment, if you have a certain mindset for X period of time, you will become that person. And I knew that I could not allow myself to be terrified for X period of time. I would be changed. I would come out of the desert a changed man. I would come back to my family. I was married. We didn't have children, but I had parents, I had siblings, lots of friends. And I knew if that was how I remained, I would come out of the desert a changed person. I needed to be liked by Al-Qaeda, and I needed to be true to myself. There's certain things in life you can control. There's certain things in life that are beyond your control. For example, what's happening now with COVID. It's beyond most people's control. Certainly, people are doing their bit to try and for us as a world to push through this. But there are so many things as individuals that we just don't have the information. It is out of our control. The only thing I had control over really was about trying to get my mind right and trying to get control of myself. And I suppose that is what I focused on, because if you're going to be kidnapped for an unknown period of time, I needed to be liked, but I also needed to be true to myself. And I truly believe that, Al-Qaeda are Al-Qaeda for a number of reasons. And you probably have a far greater intellectual, opinion on that, from all your studies and your research. I mean, what I learned there firsthand in the desert was that Al-Qaeda, besides the senior management who were educated, they were doctors themselves, besides senior management who knew exactly what they were fighting for, the ideology, a lot of the youngsters who came into the desert, who some of them were just guys straight out of the sand. Some of them were people who had been to cities, been to towns. Some of them were guys who had studied in Europe. But besides the senior management, a lot of the guys just fell into Al-Qaeda. They were poor. They had no prospects in life. The government, the Malian government, was treating them badly. The French were involved in Mali, and they saw the French as a band of robbers, a band of thieves, coming in and looting the country for the minerals and for the food. And they, in essence, were slaves of the West. And that is why they got involved there in the desert, into Al-Qaeda. And I could understand from their perspective that they fell into this. They were there for the guns and the excitement, but they weren't there for the ideology and from the religious perspective. And I could empathize with people like that. Those were the guys, I suppose, that I could really understand that they were not really a part of my kidnapping. They were the mere foot soldiers keeping me cuffed, keeping me blindfolded, keeping me aside, but they were not really there as the guys who were driving this. They were not the guys who would give the final order, right, cut his throat or do X, Y, and Z. They were pretty much operating by the Al-Qaeda handbook because they were juniors. They were guys fresh off the streets. Sorry, I feel like I'm busy lecturing you here. Yeah, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, you probably have a far greater idea as to why all these guys were there in the desert, and from an empathy perspective, it's a very difficult topic, that actually, because I was held captive for 5 years, 8 months. My family went through hell for 5 years, 8 months. I was on the brink of insanity at times while I was sitting there in the desert, just for straight fear of my family, for fear of my own life, but also what my family going through. There was no communication with my family for 5 years, 8 months. You take your cell phone, chuck it away, any conversation that I had not completed with my family, and practical things like I was going home to take over my parents' business because they were retiring. My wife and I were going home to start a family. But yet maybe I hadn't given her some bank account details or a password. Well, there was no chance of me ever getting that information across. So from an empathy perspective, it was incredibly difficult because they did rob me of 5 years, 8 months of my life. But at the same time, I'm human. And whatever Al-Qaeda took from me, I had a big fight with one of my fellow captives there in the desert. He came across to me and said to me, I don't know why you are trying to be friendly with Al-Qaeda. What are you trying to achieve? Do you not realize that Al-Qaeda have stolen from you? They've kidnapped you. You're a prisoner. They have taken your life. They've taken your family. They have robbed you. And I turned to him and I said to him, yes, you know what? You're right. You're 100% right. But we are here for an indefinite period of time. And you can handle this however you want. You can choose to be angry every single day. You can choose to be bitter. You can choose to be resentful. And you can sit inside the hut and you can sit there gritting your teeth, swearing and shouting inside. But you will change as a person and you will go home as that new person that you have just created. And in addition, yes, Al-Qaeda, they have stolen from me. They have stolen so many of my dreams from me. But the minute I allow Al-Qaeda to take me from me, the minute I allow them to take my flame, the thing that makes me smile, the thing that makes my eyes shine, the stuff that makes me get up in the morning, the minute they steal that from me, that is when they've won. That is when they've changed me, and that is when they won. Because I will go home a changed person, an angry person, and I'll be bitter to my wife, bitter to my friends, bitter to my family. I'll never be able to find a job again because no one will want to employ this crazy man who's come out of the desert. So really, that was probably the main striving reason for me to try and maintain empathy towards Al-Qaeda, to try and maintain a normal environment, because I was human, my family are human, they are human. You become a product of your environment. And I did not want to become a product of a negative environment to come home after X number of years and impact and burden the rest of society with my miserable behavior. So yeah, I mean, that really from the topic of kindness and empathy towards Al-Qaeda. This really, I suppose, is what drove me and got me through my time in the desert. I don't know if you got stuff to say on that.
Absolutely fascinating experience, and I think it's a great learning process as well. So, Stephen, other than using it as an empathy tool, you also had a huge learning experience out of this entire ordeal, right? One at the level of knowing how this group operates and what do they think and how do they live, all of that. And secondly, about yourself, you discovered a lot about yourself, and you knew that that environment of forgiveness was necessary. But my question basically is like, as you rightly said, you had these foot soldiers who joined at a very young age and really are not into the ideological aspect as much as more the monetary aspect of it. We see that in Afghanistan as well. But when you come to the ideological aspect of it, did you have that exchange where you thought that you could have that one two-way conversation between them and you, that you understand each other and you learn from each other? Did empathy play any role out there?
Certainly. I mean, like I said in the beginning, I was seen as the lowest form of life. I was absolutely hated, people looking through me. But I did convert to Islam during my time in the desert, and it certainly opened up many doors for me there in the desert. It allowed me to live. It allowed me to be seen as being human, and I truly believe that it's basically what kept my head on my shoulders. But obviously, in the beginning, I really wanted to understand why. Why did you kidnap me? What have I done? I'm a tourist. I'm from a country, South Africa. You guys don't even know about South Africa. You think South Africa is a region. You don't think it's a country. Whereas it's a country within a region, and they thought all people in South Africa are actually Africans. We should all be black. And I was like, no, well, white South Africans have been in South Africa for a couple hundred years. So they had absolutely no idea as to who I was and why I was. So my country in your eyes doesn't exist. Why on earth did you kidnap me? And I wanted to understand that I could try and have a debate with them to try and sort of put my case forward that maybe you've made an error here. But of course, Al-Qaeda, they operate via the Quran, by their interpretation of the Quran, and sometimes they make errors, and they repent. But in my case, they had not made an error. Okay, I was a white person, which made me look as though I was probably from Europe. And they kidnapped me. And the reason they kidnapped me was because the entire world is at war against Islam at the moment. They say that the West, the US, the Brits, the French, the Russians, everybody are sending troops through to Islamic countries, Muslim countries. Not that there's a single country in the world that is truly Islamic at the moment, being run by Islamic Sharia. But they were saying that since there is a war going on, and the Americans fly in and they blow up cities and towns in Iraq and Syria, it's kiss us. It is like for like punishment. So although I physically did not have my hand within a situation, I never picked up a gun and harmed any Muslim. I was guilty through association. I should have been in South Africa picketing in the streets. Not that we do that much of that in South Africa. I should have been picketing in the streets about, get out of Iraq, get out of here, get out of Afghanistan, to basically chase the other governments out. And because we are now living in a democratic country with a democratically elected government, it is assumed that I voted, because obviously democracy is haram. It is assumed that I voted. Even if I didn't vote, irrelevant. I'm living in a democratic country. I must do hijrah. I must pick up and leave the country and go to a country that is Islamic based. Otherwise, I am now a target. And also, like I say, because the West and many countries in the world are fighting in Muslim countries, because the United Nations, I think, is 95 or 98% of the world's countries, it makes every country in the world a target. And that is why I fell into this. I battled with this. I happen to believe that every person, has a right to do what they want to do. So I would never go and tell somebody that they can or can't have a religion, or they can and can't do stuff. Certainly human rights, don't kill, you shouldn't lie, treat people with respect. But I had never held any part within this war, within this greater war between the religions. But yet I was now a target. However, it did teach me a lot about Islam, and it did teach me a lot about any underdog, if you like, if I can use that term with absolute respect, if I can to speak about any person who is basically underneath the foot. you know, we're all human. We all should have a place to live in the world. And during my 5 years, 8 months within the Sahara, I certainly started to understand from Al-Qaeda's perspective. Granted, I was getting one side of the story, so I was being saturated in Al-Qaeda's part of the story. I did start to understand what they were talking about. And I don't mean it from an extremist point of view. I don't mean it from a terrorist point of view. I mean it from a purely human perspective. If somebody is getting kicked, well, they're going to stand up and fight back. And that is what I was led to believe by Al-Qaeda that was happening to the Muslims. They didn't have a country for themselves. They did not have a piece of ground where they could run with Islamic Sharia. And, you know, this was just really the high level part of it. Obviously, it was 5 years, 8 months. I mean, we would sit around in the desert, and I learned how to recite the Quran. I learned how to, you know, I learned the hadiths off by heart. And it certainly just taught me that actually, at the end of the day, if you are not driving the organization, the rest of us are all human. We all get hungry. We all get thirsty. We all want to survive. And a lot of these guys, as I was, were living in the Sahara. The days were hot. The nights were cold. We had shortages of water. We had shortages of food. And it was just a survival technique. They were those foot soldiers were in Al-Qaeda because they got guns, they got food, they got the bare necessities that governments were not supplying. Governments would come in and kill their parents, and then they would leave and join Al-Qaeda because they saw about the corruption within militaries, they saw about the corruption within governments, and a lot of them there joined Al-Qaeda and would come and talk to me and moan and complain about the Malian government. How can they do this? We're angry. We hate the Malian government. If I saw a Malian soldier, I would stab them with my own knife, they would tell me. And they would. I mean, I can't relate to that. I actually do not believe that anybody should inflict their own opinions and their own harm onto other people. But that is through the anger that they had experienced for their generation, for their lives, that they were now involved in this. Sorry, I'm jumping all over the show here.
Yeah, it's again very interesting because you do have balance in Afghanistan. The disproportionate use of force itself creates a situation where there's a revenge factor playing in. And, someone in the family gets killed, so the son or the brother goes and joins the insurgent group just to take a revenge. And I think that, again, has not been really understood and studied. But again, I think just a fascinating ordeal in the sense of your own evolution, Stephen, here. I'm a little curious about the other two captives who had their own strategies of dealing with the entire kidnapping, and your empathy as a tool. Did it come naturally, and did the others adopt that, or was it a technique which you thought would help you with the situation while in crisis and after crisis?
You see, I mean, it certainly was my strategy, and we did all that. The three of us did have different strategies there in the desert. The one captive was a very funny guy. He was the comedian there, and but he also had a crazy temper. So he would he would try and be the clown in the camp, but every so often he lost his cool and he would just explode. So he also lost a lot of respect from Al-Qaeda with that respect. The other captive, well, he just wanted to escape the whole time. And because of this, he became known as dangerous. And because he was dangerous, it impacted all of us prisoners. All of us then had a difficult time in the desert. I had things confiscated from me. I had water taken from me, not because of my behavior, but because of one of the other captives' behavior. So we did, and I could then look and see how Al-Qaeda was viewing both of them and viewing both of me. I could sort of start to see who was being favored between the three of us. And again, look, I would have been the first to have gotten my head, my neck slit, my head chopped off. So I wanted to form relationships, inverted commas, with these guys. But that was something that came relatively naturally for me. Like I say, if you are pretending to be something for X period of time, at some stage you will slip up and you'll make a mistake. And then Al-Qaeda would pick up on that. If Al-Qaeda saw you make that mistake, they would see you as being a fake and a fraud. And I would have fell from grace spectacularly. And all the work I put into building relationships and to, form a life while I was there in the desert would have come crumbling down. And, I would have basically, again, been at the bottom of the food chain and again, the first to be slaughtered. So I did my approach because I wanted to be liked. I saw from a strategy, I needed to be liked. But fortunately, as a person, I enjoy people. I want to understand people. I want to have conversation with people. I don't like this world from the perspective that everybody's pointing a finger at everybody else. We are all so judgmental about other people. It's disgusting how judgmental we are. But we should be embracing cultures. There is such beauty in difference. I wake up in the morning, I go through my routine, I go to bed. Tomorrow I wake up, I go through my routine, I go to bed. That is so boring. But when you come across other cultures, there's so much to learn. There's so much beauty in it. Different foods, different languages. I learned how to speak Arabic very badly while I was there in the desert. But I tried to learn the culture. I learned how to slaughter animals. I learned how to prepare meat. I learned how to build huts. I learned how to make rope out of grass. I saturated, I submerged myself in their culture. Because if they were going to kill me, they were going to kill me. But if they weren't going to kill me, let me live and make the most of this difficult time that I was going through. And I was the last to be released. Ironically, I should have, I would have thought that my approach would have got me out of there a bit earlier, but I was the last to be released. But who knows? God has a plan, and that was part of God's plan. So who am I to question or judge anyway? But being friendly, being inclusive, getting involved allows you to experience a situation. It allows you to understand people. And sometimes I had conversations with Al-Qaeda, with the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda, deep conversations, proper, full-blown conversations. It wasn't always talking about a sandstorm or talking about the next meal. I discussed family life. I discussed the religion. I discussed things going on in Europe. Some of the guys were from Europe. And I had proper conversations, all in Arabic. It was all in Arabic. So this conversation we're having now, I could have had in Arabic using little words, but I could have had this conversation we're having now because it was my life for 6 years. But being accepting of the people, not accepting of the situation because I was a prisoner for 5 years, 8 months, but being accepting of the people and trying to understand the people added so much color to my experience. I could have come out of the desert hating everybody, but I didn't. And it wouldn't have benefited me to hate everybody. If I came out, we all have tough times and we all have a lot of reasons to point fingers and hate people, but it doesn't benefit us. And I truly believe that the most important thing in life really is people. You cannot buy people. You cannot buy relationships. You can pretend to buy relationships. Someone will come and smile and be friendly, but you cannot actually connect with them. And at the end of the day, we're all going to die anyway. So for me, it's about the journey and about getting along with people. And and truly my approach there in the desert, to stay alive and to be true to myself, because that really was one of the biggest things there in the desert. You've got to be true to yourself. And I suppose we all were. The one hostage was true to trying to escape. The other hostage was true to being funny, and then true to having an absolute temper tantrum. And I was true to try and be friendly. And I think out of all of the different strategies, my strategy probably worked the best. It allowed me probably to interact the most. It allowed me to come out of the desert complete. And funny, I was talking to a documentary producer about 3 months after I was released out of the desert. And he flew to South Africa from another country. And he had interviewed one of the other hostages, and he came and spoke to me. And he came and he said to me, I actually think that you are the most balanced out of all the hostages at the moment. And because he said he had interviewed the other hostage, and he said the other hostage is not speaking about stuff. He's holding things in. He could see he was still being complicated. He thought that I was the most balanced. And it may have been because, you put it out there, you be friendly, you smile, you laugh, you joke, you try to see the best in any situation. Because if you're going to get through it, what's more important than getting out, being complete, and trying to continue in the real world and actually having some stories from the past? Having some stories that you can actually add value to a situation. I mean, I'm doing a lot of corporate talks at the moment, and it's amazing. I'm doing a lot in South Africa. I'm doing some in the US. I'm doing some in Singapore, some in the Middle East. I've done some in India, actually. And it's truly international. And the part that blows me away, the part that I can embrace, is that I went through a terrible situation. My mom passed away during my time in captivity. 5 years, 6 months into my captivity, my mom died, and then 2 months later, I was released. So it certainly wasn't an easy trip. I mean, people battled. I mean, it's difficult to explain to you what it is like having a gun against your head and being handcuffed and somebody screaming at you, and you can literally count down the seconds till they're going to pull the trigger, and then it's, lights out. it's still, I mean, I don't actually know how to put that, how to describe that. All I can tell you is that I can feel my emotions sitting in my throat here, because it runs deep. It runs deep. But, life is good. You got to make the most of it. Some of us are thrown into a situation. We don't mean to be there. Some of Al-Qaeda are thrown into their situation. They are only there out of desperation. So certainly I could judge them, but otherwise I could try and get to understand them and actually live my life there in the desert, hoping that one day I'll go home. Anyway, here I am, 5 years, 8 months later, I was released and I came home. And how that took place, I don't know. Was it with government intervention, or was it purely my approach with Al-Qaeda? Because I could talk to you about this, about my release for a long time, but it may have been that Al-Qaeda actually just said to me, listen, we like you, go home. Because I was pretty much smuggled out of the desert, behind the French's back, behind the South Africans' back. Al-Qaeda literally just took me out. Maybe being friendly, being nice, empathizing, getting involved, being a part of something. Not from a terrorist perspective, because I'm not a terrorist, but being a part of something from a perspective that you are coping and living and making the most normal environment you can out of a difficult situation. Because that's ultimately what we all need in difficult times. And also being true to yourself. Because if you start selling your own soul, well, who are you at the end of the day?
Absolutely fascinating. And you could feel every emotion as you are talking, Stephen. And hats off to you that you came out of it and came out well. But I'm sure that whatever you've spoken today and you've been talking about will help a lot of individuals to get into such situation. But more importantly, also about, helping the law enforcement agencies understand how to deal with these groups. I think there is a gap here, and the use of force itself doesn't really help in many situations, and we have seen that. And as you rightly said, if you have any kind of learning lessons, like for instance, in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, the use of force has been counterproductive at times, and the whole process of reintegrating individuals who want to come back to the society has not really occurred. So we do see that kind of situation, but more importantly, it's also about the kind of work experience you had, which would, in research terms, qualify into ethnographic data. You are there, you understand the culture, you understand the individual, and you're writing about it. And you've written a book now, so I'm sure that's a must-read book. Just not for those who get into kidnapping situation and come out as balanced individuals, but more as a tool of understanding how to deal with the situation and as you come out of that situation. You were there, Stephen, you were there. I mean, it was a matter of accident for you. I go there as a matter of choice, and I keep going back to Afghanistan as many times as I can, because the country draws me. That country has made me understand things which I didn't understand a lot about Afghanistan. And so there is this fascinating experience in Afghanistan as well, which maybe I can talk about later. But then if you have to look from your experience and draw parallels and lessons for individuals and for the governments, what would be your approach? What would you suggest, ways for the governments to deal with these groups? Is there a gap that the government can address when they're dealing with such individuals? If you have any thoughts, Stephen, it would be useful. I mean, you're talking to the corporate world, you're talking to a larger audience. One is, I think, to understand what the governments can do. The second is what society can do. What can schools and communities do? I think that's one area where we haven't had much intervention and much understanding of what approaches you could take, be it in school, in using empathy, when certain individuals get drawn into this kind of ideology. And that occurs even when you're surfing the internet, the online radicalization process is also occurring. So do you think you have some kind of lessons, or do you like to share some thoughts about it?
It's interesting, hey, because I've been approached by a number of secret services and a number of governments around the world when I came out of the desert. But I would have actually thought that there would have been more interest from secret services. I don't know if they were I don't know if the South African government was fielding everybody away from me, because obviously I'm unstable and I've come out of the desert from terrorists. So they give him space, leave him alone. But I have had a few conversations. I mean, this conversation about what governments can do could actually be an entire conversation, with you and I at some stage about it. It's a very complicated situation. because from my experience, from the senior management within Al-Qaeda, it is purely about the Quran. You know, life operates in the desert. Life operated around the 5 prayers of the day. A war would operate around the 5 prayers of the day. If you were standing behind a tree and there were bullets flying past you, but it was 2 o'clock and time for Salat Dhuhr, well, you will do your prayer behind the tree. You will just while you're shooting, you will do your prayer. So what I'm trying to say here is that senior management with Al-Qaeda are there because of the religion. And they truly believe. I met some people there who had been to university in Europe. They were super rich. They had millions of dollars in the bank. They had their X5, they had their ML Merc, they had their Range Rovers. And they threw that all away. And they were 29, 30 years old. They threw that all away to go and fight in Mali and sit in the sand and slaughter animals and eat out of a bowl. You know, what I'm saying is that they are there because of the religion. They're not there because of government's shortfalls. They're not there because of poverty. But those are the educated people. The educated people are there because of that. Some of the middle management have got they've got asthma, they've got deformalities, they've got health problems. They are there because when you go to Jannah, you are complete. And they believe that when this all comes to a close and you go to the afterlife, you are complete. So rather go fight and get killed in dunya, on earth, because the shorter earth is, well, the more time you have in eternity in paradise. And then the juniors, well, they are there purely from the perspective that they want to eat. They want a cool story. These guys, you know, they're used to walking. They are 100 kilometers into the Sahara. They walk from the well. They walk from their hut to the well, to the hut to the well, every single day with 50 goats. Life's boring. One of their friends drives in on the back of a Land Cruiser, the same age, 14 years old, with a gun, having just been to Libya, having just beheaded somebody else, having seen crazy animals, eaten funny things, and he's got stories. Now, the guy who's walking to the well and back every single day is, well, I want to be the guy on the back of the Land Cruiser. So this is a very deep topic, because there's so many different tiers that one can discuss actually from a government perspective. And then, of course, there's, well, how can governments handle post-release? And that is a part that I'm very passionate about, because I believe my situation was handled incredibly badly after my release. So I could even advise governments as to what does the prisoner require on returning back home. You know, I mean, there's many topics we can talk about on this. I don't think we have the time, unfortunately, today to talk about it.
Actually, we're having some questions from the audience as well. So if there are more questions, I would like to just club some of these questions, because I think we will be running out of time soon. But if there is any question from the audience, can you please put out your questions now? But there are a few other questions which I thought are quite interesting and useful to our conversation now, of looking at how society can use this empathy to understand and get individuals who are moving into a certain extremist ideology back. Stephen, again, if you have any questions about how we can make this empathy as a tool, maybe in educational curriculums, in community-based approaches, and, you know, a certain kind of maybe counseling centers or something of that sort. What are your views about that? There's some questions coming on this now.
You know, I certainly believe one of the things that we forget about in life, and I think a lot of young children really experience this, is about being an individual. You know, being who you are, believing in who you are, believing that you have the tools, believing that you have the right to be heard and to say something. And I don't mean in South Africa fashion, burning tires and breaking houses. I mean being able to speak up with respect. And I think a lot of young people do not actually realize that they hold value. Every person holds value, and young people, they must be confident in themselves as who they are, and that they have a right and a platform to be able to speak and be heard amongst their peers, amongst anybody, you know, in a non-violent approach. And I think this is one of the most important things in life, because it allows you, you know, it gives you self-worth. And then you don't go and jump into these extremist organizations. It also allows you to actually know your value. And I think a lot of people, when they lose value, they don't know who they are. They get lost in this world. Older people like you and I, you know, people get beaten down by by the difficulties of life. Half the world's on antidepressants, half the world's on anti-anxieties. People are confused. People are confused. And I think schools need to go a long way to basically create character within children. And extramural activities well beyond curriculums, and I can say this from a prisoner perspective, because in the desert, if I only had mathematics and science and biology and geography, there were so many tools beyond that I actually required, to survive as a hostage, basic medication. I mean, how far can someone walk on 5 liters of water when it's 40 degrees outside? I've got no idea, but that information would have been priceless for me. General education beyond school curriculums. But I would say one of the most important things that people need to learn about themselves is self-awareness, and figuring out that they can actually make a difference in this world. Because I think when they are figuratively handcuffed, that is when people start to lose value, lose character, and they start to find alternate means to express themselves. But I've been doing a lot of talks here in South Africa for schools as well, and I'm actually going to be doing some short videos and trying to set up a small course for school kids in South Africa as well. And I think it is priceless. We all get one chance at life. We all have a right to be able to express ourselves and be ourselves. And it's not, to use the word fair, this is not utopia. But it's not fair for people to squash other people's dreams and to squash other people as individuals. It's not fair for us to, live and let live. Live and let live. We all have a place. It's not fair for other people to come and basically remove other people, their dreams, their ideas, and their lives from the world. But I am doing a lot of corporate talks as well, and so all over the world. So people can contact me if they would like more information. If we would like to do talks for corporates or schools or forums or whatever it may be.
If there are any questions from the audience, I would like to take it. I do see a few questions, but if there are any more questions, please do reach out. Stephen, I think there's one more question about, as a survival strategy. I mean, would you like to talk a bit more about your experience per se in the desert, of how it impacted you? Because there's some questions on that count. And secondly, did it make any impact on the captors as say? You mentioned that in your talk initially, but I see a question there.
Yeah, I mean, survival strategy, hey? I mean, a survival strategy is trying to see the best in every single day and trying to make the most of everything that you've been given, and trying to be positive, because attitude is absolutely everything. Your attitude is your reality. Even with a bag over your head and a gun against your head, if you can try to see the best in that dark situation, well, it's only half as bad as it could be. So really about keeping a positive attitude and trying to push through. Believe things are going to pass and tomorrow will be better.
Right. I think we are almost at the end of our time. Unless there are more questions, I think, Vasanthi, over to you.
Yes, so I hope I still have Stephen on the line. Thank you so much, Shanthie. It was an absolutely compelling conversation. What Stephen said is not going away in a hurry. And some of the questions that have come in are also proof that people have been listening in, and therefore many candid questions. There is one from Kubesh Govinder, who says that he is, I think he did say that he is from South Africa as well, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the question is that, does your conversion to Islam mean that you condone the ideology and practices of Al-Qaeda? Stephen.
Wow. Okay. Look, most certainly. I mean, I do condone the practices of Al-Qaeda. I don't, I was an innocent tourist and I was held for 5 years, 8 months away from my family, and it impacted so many people. I certainly do condone Al-Qaeda. It is so difficult, I converted to Islam. I learned a lot in Islam. I'm now back in the real world, back in South Africa, back out of the desert. And I've still got a lot to learn. I've still got a lot to learn about, a lot to investigate, if you like. I'm currently, if you like, between religions. I certainly believe in God. I am confused. I am not quite sure what it is to be moderate. I have learned from Al-Qaeda. It requires a lot of conversation with a lot of level-headed people who can give me a lot of level-headed answers. And that is where I am at the moment. Yeah. But I believe in peace.
Yeah. And I think, at least reflecting on this question, there's a very thin line between empathy and condoning as the world sees it. I think even that the talk today is about empathy, you have walked that thin line, as in to understand them, to make such a genuine attempt. And you said that you actually lived the life of that. You had such intense conversations with those who are part of Al-Qaeda, including the young people that you said. And then, of course, to also have a certain distance from which you're viewing it, because that's what ultimately, I think, keeps you balanced and that won your freedom, ultimately.
100%. I mean, if I were to saturate myself in the killing, I mean, I would have come out crazy as well. I can empathize with what people go through. I can empathize with why some Al-Qaeda members join Al-Qaeda. I can empathize with their view on corrupt governments, with their view on people killing their families, with them having tough lives, with them with them not having water, with them not having sanitation. I can empathize with that. I cannot empathize with what they did to me. I cannot empathize with the fact that they took 5 years, 8 months and inconvenienced and had such an impact on so many people. So I can empathize with the person, but I cannot empathize with the big rolling machine and what it's doing.
I think you put it very, very clearly. And one question Jay wants to ask is that, is there a way to measure the impact of your talks that you have given to others, let's say the corporates, some of the personal and deep experience that you have shared? What do you think has been an impact on them?
I think, okay, look, I mean, how do I measure it? I measure it by people coming up to me in tears afterwards. And I've had CEOs, like even on Zoom calls, I've had a CEO saying, right, excuse me, everybody, let me just pull myself back together. Wow, yes, that was quite something. In fact, you actually brought me to tears there. And that's, and that's also to a couple hundred people and all of his staff. So, and I've had a lot of messages. I've had people email me directly saying to me, gee whiz, Steve, I'm also having a tough time. My mom's got cancer and my dad died of this. And I'm angry with my grandmother. How would you handle this? And yeah, I've had overwhelming results. I mean, well, I can't say results because, it's not, I'm not learned in this. I'm just sharing my story with people. And if people find value in it, that is amazing, that good things can come from bad times. I've had other people sitting in an audience with their arms crossed, looking out the windows, and they looked so angry. And I thought, well, you can't please everybody. And at the end of my talk, that man with huge biceps walked up to me and he gave me a hug and cried on my shoulder and said, I fought in Iraq. And I too went through a roadblock where my friend got blown up, and your talk was tearing me apart inside. And I'm sorry I could not engage because it was just, the PTSD was just running wild. But yeah. Wow, I'm so, I'm just in awe and big hug. And those things are what make the biggest impact on me, when I can actually see that it has touched somebody else's life. And because I think we are all so busy trying to keep up with our neighbors, keep up with the Joneses, as they say. We're too busy buying fancy cars. We're too busy trying to make these huge flipping enterprises and money. And what for? And while we do this, we are selling our soul. We are selling who we are. We are losing contact with what's important with ourselves and important in life. We lose ourselves. And so I think so many people have actually enjoyed this talk because, I mean, I do have a structured talk. This has been a conversation. I do have a structured talk. A lot of guys have enjoyed the thing because everyone's got tough times. And we all seem to become very shallow, and we start moaning about a leaking tap in the kitchen, or now, somebody knocked my tree over on the pavement, and like, oh, this is the final straw. But actually, these are such small problems. And I had a friend of mine, very good friend of mine. I came out the desert, and I went for a barbecue at their house, and they had 2 children at fancy schools, and they had their Land Rover Discovery, one, in I don't know what, $40,000 or whatever it is. And I was sitting down, I was talking to the wife, and I said, gee whiz, look at this. You guys must be so proud. I've been away for 6 years. I've come back. You guys have created an empire. And she turned to me and said to me, Steve, we're actually battling. It hasn't been easy. All of our friends have got Range Rovers, and we have a Land Rover.
Oh,
I tell you, when I looked at that, I just thought, this is so sad. How you put such pressure on yourself, how you do not appreciate or value what the blessings that you have been given. You don't appreciate it. You are so blessed, but yet you choose to make more stress because your friends have got a more expensive car, but your car no one can afford anyway. So what are you doing? And I think that is the thing. People get caught up in life with such small, petty things. They overcomplicate life. They focus on things that are not important. And I think that is also where, you know, people have enjoyed my talk because it's relevant. You know, simplify things. Be focused on people. See the beauty in life, because actually life is too good to waste. And I think
one last question. So, though this hasn't really come to the audience, but I was very curious. You said it was really heartbreaking to hear about how you lost your mother so close to your release. Just a note on what it was for your family. What did they go through? If you can just quickly sum it up for us.
Yeah.
Your partner feeling you back.
Yeah, no, look, so I've just written this book, all right, and it was published in November last year, and we've just signed for world rights, so it's going to be across the globe by July. But writing of this book allowed me to start to understand what my family went through, because there wasn't a lot, 6 years is so much information. How do you put 6 years into 3 years? I mean, I would have to talk to my family continuously for 3 years to actually understand what they went through. So I'm beginning to understand. I mean, I know it's been terribly difficult. My family, my dad was running a business. He was looking after my mom before she passed away, and he was trying to get me out of the desert. Every door he tried to open with respect to get my release got shut on him. He was talking to mercenaries. He was talking to clairvoyants. He was talking to governments, talking to journalists, anybody who would listen, and everybody shut those doors on him. So from a frustration point of view, that his son had been kidnapped was incredibly difficult. My wife, I was 36 when I got kidnapped. My wife was 34. We were coming home to have children, start a family, 34, there's only so much more time you've got to actually have kids. And I got kidnapped until I was 42. So my wife at this stage was 39. So that window period of having kids was now shut. The situation impacted so many people in such a deep manner that it runs deep, and I think my family are still trying to get their head around it. There's still some deep issues, I probably don't even understand completely. I've only been out the desert 3 years. I was kidnapped for 6 years. I've been out 3 years. It's still new. I'm still trying to make sense. I saw a psychologist 3 times when I came out the desert. And, there's still so much for me to figure out about myself and about, really coming to terms with the impact that it had on my mum, the impact it had on my wife, the impact it had on my dad. Everybody puts on a happy, brave face, but it's not often that you actually get beneath that brave face to get the true feelings, because generally we all end up in tears. So it's quite a...
But Stephen, I must hand it to you that even when you're in the process of, processing what you actually have gone through, you have managed to distill some of those lessons for us. And that is so precious. Coming in the Kindness Festival on day 2, this was one of the most unforgettable sessions.